the newsagents.
This is our final election Q&A.
Oh.
Do it a bit more with sincerity.
Oh.
Still no good. Okay, we'll have to put sound effects in.
No Goodall.
But these are your questions, and they're all about election night, sort of what time you can go to bed and when you can move, and what's the first time you should have a drink or a coffee or whatever.
And some people have probably just voted when they're listening to this already.
That is
so it's
true.
Very exciting.
Yes, exactly.
Very exciting.
Yes.
So the first question is from George in Washington in the northeast. That's as opposed to
George Washington.
Yeah.
We heard from Andrew Jackson the other week.
Yeah, and that's
it's good that all the former
You're
presidents...
making this up, you lot.
Yeah.
You are making this up.
from
can't wait
George
for-
in Washington in the northeast.
I can't wait for our question from Martin Van Buren. That's going to be an absolute cracker.
Dear newsagents, I have an early train to travel from Newcastle to London on Friday for my sister's wedding this weekend. What would you suggest is the latest I stay up, knowing that I want to see as much of election night unfold as possible, but also make sure I don't sleep in and cause some family drama? Cause family drama, George. Just go for it.
go for
I mean,
it.
look, election
Realistic-
night.
look,
Your sister can get remarried.
Exactly. There's only going to be one election like this. Realistically,
She
there
can
could be
get
several
married every
marriages to
year.
come.
Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly.
Renewal of vows. There are all sorts
Yeah.
of options for her.
Yeah.
So, George, you lucky thing is what I can say, because there is a lot to come on Thursday night. Wait up for Basildon and Billericay, which is the Tory party chairman's seat. Wait up for South Swindon, which is Robert Buckland's seat. Wait up for the first of the SNP Labour seats, which will be
It's going to be up all
1:30,
night. I'm telling you, this is the only
No,
answer.
and I'm saying go to bed at 2:00. Most of the seats actually will come through between 2 and 3, but they'll be fairly... Yeah.
Channel
You'll get it.
4's lead presenter there for election night saying, go to bed at 2 o'clock. All right.
Come with
Welcome
me,
to the
come with
newsagents.
me.
It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
I
case
feel
you couldn't
badly
tell.
now. I feel bad now. I didn't want to send anyone to bed.
No, you said you sent George to bed.
No, he's going to stay up. Come on. That's the thing.
Should we have a voice note
I think
from
I've
Nimit?
given him a taste.
Shush.
All right.
Voice note from Nimit, please.
Hello, newsagents. Big fan of the podcast over here. Just want to say thank you for all the election coverage you've given us so far. I think it's been brilliant. I've got a question about exit polling and off-the-record versus on-the-record commentary. I famously remember Paddy Ashdown in 2015 willing to eat his hat if the Liberal Democrats were completely obliterated. Would you have found in those situations that you have MPs or former MPs who are on TV, on radio, in the media, trying to spin the exit poll one way, so it's sort of saving face almost on the record, but off the record, actually, they really do believe the outcome of the exit poll? And is that something that you guys sort of have it in and out of? And do you find that that's a difficult picture to portray to the public when you're doing your reporting as well? Thanks again.
It's a good question, isn't it? I mean, generally, whoever you go to first on the night will say to you, Nimit, this is just a poll, it's just a poll, you know, even at the exit poll, which is in a way slightly disingenuous because it has been 30 years now since exit polls.
They've got so good at it.
They're so good at it that sometimes the most interesting thing is just to watch your guest's face as they land. Everyone's looking at the exit poll. You want to turn around and you just want to watch your guests' faces.
Should we explain the exit poll? Not
Yes,
everyone knows, do
go
they?
on.
So just very quickly. So the exit poll is the first time that we have, in effect, people's real votes. Because what happens is the team of psephologists, sort of expert number crunchers who put it together for the broadcasters, they send out a team who stand outside actually quite a small number of key polling stations across the country, and they ask people as they're emerging from the...
They ask you to vote again.
Yeah,
You
they
actually
basically-
get another anonymous
you-
ballot. So you do what you have just done anonymously.
Exactly
and then
right.
they count.
Exactly right. And so then what they're able to do is get those results and compare them to those same polling stations that they did in the previous cycle, so in 2019. And using that and the just sort of wizardry of maths, they basically can extrapolate the result across the country. And they have got, as Emily was saying, so good at it. It normally is, and it has become now for election after election, going back lots and lots of cycles, generally on the money. It might be a little bit out here and there, but it's more or less on the money.
Yeah, and it's different from how they do it in France.
Yeah.
Where in France, they actually are allowed to sample votes that have been cast
In the
at
ballot
polling-
boxes.
in the ballot boxes. And that is why kind of, you know, at 8 o'clock in France, they are so accurate that people really do think, okay, well, we know the result now because these are on the basis. So they have become more and more sophisticated. But the on the record, off the record, And you mentioned Paddy Ashdown there. I had an incident.
I mean, he did it on the record. He
Yeah,
said on the record.
He couldn't have been more on the record.
No, and he believed it, I think. He just believed that it was going to be
So in
better than that.
But in 2010, I bumped into him immediately after the day after the election, morning after the election, when it was unclear whether it would be a Conservative coalition that would be formed or a Labour coalition, and Labour were desperately trying to shore up support. And Paddy Ashdown said to me, off the record, over the course of a breakfast, that there is no way that this can possibly happen, that we can prop up a Labour government. And I went on air and said all of that. There were furious calls from Number 10 to me, from Peter Mandelson and others, saying this is absolute nonsense. Of course we can pull this off. And then when it was still possible, Paddy Ashdown went on TV and said, I have no idea where this speculation comes from.
Amazing.
And I thought, you told me.
Amazing.
You actually told me that. That was from you. So there is a gap between what politicians are prepared to say to you off the record and what they will then say on the record.
And what is more common is that there are just loads of, someone knows you're working on an election night where you're either part of or adjacent to the exit poll.
They try and tell you things that they want you to say out loud.
Exactly. So they try and...
Well, they're trying to find out what it is.
They're trying to find what it is, because the political parties don't know, right? This is the key thing. The only people who know are, and there's this amazing moment, when I did Sky in 2017 and 19, there's this amazing moment when they're all going away, all of the psephologists, they're going away, and they basically, everyone's phone has to be locked away, you can't take your phone in, and they're going to crunch the final numbers, and it's a sealed room, and you as broadcasters only get told about it very shortly beforehand. So if political operatives know that you're involved in that, they'll be texting you trying to find out what the numbers are. Illegal to tell them, can't actually tell them, but they will try and find out so they can brief their politicians, their principals who are the first on the airwaves, give them at least a line that they can, because otherwise they're just reacting completely cold. That happened in 2015. You remember when Harriet Harman was first out of the tracks and the exit poll came out, and it was such an unexpectedly low number for Labour, and you could just see the shock on her face. She sort of knew it was kind of true, but didn't quite know what to say.
Yeah, and I'd just say, I mean, one caveat is, it is an intensely personal moment. I know we treat the whole thing as like the most exciting thing ever, but actually for everyone who is either winning or losing, it is an intensely personal moment, and there are quite a lot of really sort of profound personal stories in that. And I think sometimes, you have to tread quite carefully.
Yeah.
Oh, people feel unbelievably vulnerable and insecure. And of course, this is their livelihood. And they feel they've put, years and years into a patch of territory of the UK where they've cared about it. They've cared about the hospitals and the health centres and the schools and everything else. And then they get booted out by National Swing.
Well, James's question is quite related to Nimitz. Says, hi, news agents. Listened since day one and always wanted to ask a question. Well, he's managed to find a way of doing it because we've not been telling anyone. Has an exit poll ever been called at 10 p.m. and got it completely wrong? I'm looking forward to the long night.
Yes, a long night. Well, I guess 92, James. Yeah. That's the one that is kind of etched into all our memories. And if you go back and you watch the BBC moment with David Dimbleby there, they say hung Parliament, and they say that the Conservatives, I think, would be 10 short and Labour would be 13 short. So it looked as if it was absolutely neck and neck, no one party having sort of overall control or a majority.
Which accorded to the polls running up to that moment.
Right, and which is where we kind of glean this idea of the shy Tories from, that people were voting Conservative but weren't saying it out loud to the pollsters, and that was wrong. And of course, John Major did go on to win that election, and he got a majority of, I think, 21.
So I was at National Liberal headquarters that night because they were expecting a hung Parliament, and the Liberal Democrats could have been holding the balance of power and therefore be the kingmakers over what was going to happen. Yeah. I mean, it turned out that the Tories got a majority, and at 3:00 in the morning, someone threw up over my shoes as I was just about to go live with Dimbleby to say it's all gone very quiet here because he got so drunk. But prior to that, I think what was striking about that night is not just that the exit poll was wrong, and this is where it was a catastrophe for the BBC and its relations with the Conservative Party, was that rather than saying it had got it wrong, it just would, every new result, recalculate the exit poll so that it would eventually accept that there would be a Tory majority. And rather than saying, I think our exit poll looks like it's wrong, it looked like the BBC was reluctant to accept the idea that the Conservatives had won a majority and was okay, grudgingly, we'll shift the dial a bit more and the snow swingometer will just go another inch towards the Conservative Party.
But that was pretty much the last time. I mean, we have been so accurate. I think in I think in 2001, 2005, it was absolutely down to the seat accurate.
2015 was slightly off in a sense that it showed Conservatives easily being the largest party, but didn't actually show a absolute majority. So it was slightly up, but it was only up because the numbers were so slight. It was only off by about 15 or so, but those 15 made all the difference in terms
of course, to whether you crossed the line.
Whether you crossed the line. So that matters.
1970,
1970, I think, was another example where they predicted a Wilson winning, and then Heath unexpectedly won.
Yeah.
But obviously, that's going back a long way, and the methodology has got so much sharper since then.
Yes, I mean the way that polling is done now is a completely different space to the Heath victory in 70.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Harry Brown from South Norfolk. Does your role as high-profile, very well-connected Westminster journalist influence the way you vote? I'm not asking for your voting intentions or political ideology. I'm just wondering if seeing these parties as up close as you do, presumably knowing things that the general public do not, has ever made you either more wary or more enthusiastic? It's the hardest question of them all, that, isn't it?
Oh my God, I keep thinking about how I can answer this question. It's really tricky.
I mean, I think it is true that you come up against candidates first, and then MPs, and then ministers, and then, maybe prime ministers. I mean, in these rare moments. So you have watched their own political journey right the way through. And I think whatever party, there will be some people that you find easier, more engaging as an interview, more receptive to your questions, more accommodating of, the sort of work you're trying to do or the stuff you're trying to ask. I don't think that is about ideology at all, but I think, as in life, you forge relationships with personal, politicians on all sides of the spectrum.
I think actually the harder bit is not about voting. The bigger challenge, and it's always a challenge, is the balance between, it is inevitable if you're a political journalist that you get to know some of these people. Not necessarily just politicians, but people who work for them and so on. And it's not that you get excessively pally, but inevitably if you sort of see the real person, which you do, you become more cognizant of the fact that they're a real person, right? And you might see that this person is sort of trying their best in very difficult circumstances, and that can inevitably, if you're not careful, it might soften too much the way you sort of perceive things or broadcast about
things. Which is why
I
think politicians now are personalising the political.
Also, there's such a tremendous incentive on people like us these days, particularly with social media, to want, people often yearn, they want to see people beat up the whole time, right? They want to see, and you just know if you do that, obviously it'll fly on socials and on all that sort of thing. But there's also that balance as well. I mean, I certainly feel, I'm sure you feel as well, which is that, I admire politicians. I don't admire them all individually, but I admire someone who goes into politics, right? Because it is highly necessary. It's a really tough life, and without it our political system would fall apart. And so when you can see someone who is engaged in the arena in that way, albeit taking loads and loads of fire, there is an incentive to treat them badly or be unpleasant to them, and you have to balance that with the fact that that in many cases they are, the old cliche, doing their best in difficult circumstances.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think that of course we get up close. During the 97 campaign, I spent every day on the road with John Major, and even though it was clear to me that he was going down in flames, I didn't think it was going to be quite that big, the Labour victory. There was an absolute decency about him. There was good fun. I remember it was going to be my mother's 70th birthday, and him and Norma did a little video for her to wish her happy 70th birthday. We played that, and he was really good company on the road, and you felt an affection for it. And I also thought that actually the British people could sense that they weren't going to vote for him, but they kind of quite liked him, and that will colour your judgment a bit about how you think of him as
because the
a
battle
Prime
bus
Minister.
is it is like being embedded.
Yeah,
isn't it, essentially?
Totally.
And everyone who's on the battle bus says, well, they're feeling pretty upbeat, pretty chipper. Because you are part of that sort of, I guess, environment that says it's all going to be fine.
Yeah, and then there were, it kind of sounds ridiculous to say it, but, like I got on pretty well with Blair. I did not get on very well with Gordon Brown. And, and you could see the way that people were treated in different administrations, and that colours your judgment about potentially how you might vote, because you just think, well, can't bear him. Is this person good for the country or bad for the country? I'm not sure. And then it can colour your judgment.
Charlie from Cardiff has a question. Says, "Hi news agents, long time listener here and love the show." It's nice that we've been going long enough now to have people say long time listener, isn't it? Like,
Yeah.
sort of
Like we've been going for 30 years.
Yeah, well, it feels that way. If Starmer wins a majority on Thursday and becomes PM, I was wondering what the mechanism is for him actually becoming Prime Minister. How will he actually become PM, and when will the Labour Party actually be the official party of power? How long does Rishi to get to move all this stuff out of Downing Street?
We have a brutally efficient system here. I mean, I'm not going to open our first past the post, PR sort of battle here, but because of the way our system works, it is brutally efficient. And sometimes I think the incoming Prime Minister is thinking, well, actually, I don't want to, put everything in Downing Street. It's really hard for the kids. It's really hard for your spouse. It's really hard to say, your kids will now get a sort of armed guard to take them to school, and you're going to live in this ridiculous place. There is no more ridiculous place than 10 Downing Street, which is an extraordinary kind of warren of offices, really, that you're meant to make your family home.
But the answer
So just on the technicalities, you can be sure that the King's private secretary will have arranged a call for when would be the best time to come in to Buckingham Palace and kiss the ring, and the King asks you to form a government.
So we need a concession speech, we need an acceptance speech, technically, and then we need the King to invite the next Prime Minister to form the new government.
And then they will go, so the choreography will be, if it is Keir Starmer, that Keir Starmer will be picked up at home. He will then be driven to Buckingham Palace. He will then drive to Downing Street. At Downing Street, the Cabinet Secretary and the Civil Service staff will be there to applaud as he walks in. He is the Prime Minister. It happens with brutal speed. Yeah. In America, you have the election on the first Tuesday in November. On January the 20th, that is when the new president takes over. You have a transition that goes on for nearly 2 months, whereby, longer than 2 months, whereby you are appointing the key people, you are getting briefed on all the key issues, and that is when you take over.
Yeah, well, I mean, the speed of it in Britain is extraordinary. And I can't imagine what that moment must be like, meeting the monarch, and then he just says, "Congratulations, Prime Minister," and that's it. You are Prime Minister. There's no inauguration. There's nothing to read or anything like that. It's just being invited. But I mean, the brutality talking about moving out. I mean, when you don't necessarily expect it. So I mean, Harold Wilson did not expect to lose again. Going back to the 1970 election, did not expect to lose in 1970. He actually had nowhere to go that weekend because he'd expected to win, and so the incoming Prime Minister Ted Heath allowed him to use Chequers for the weekend, just so he could arrange somewhere for him to go in London and so on. And likewise in 74 when he took over, the famous piano. The piano. Coming out of Downing Street.
The piano was almost anthropomorphic. The piano seemed somehow to embody the Prime Minister who'd just been thrown out on the street, because there was no disguising the shape of that piano.
Ted Heath was a musician, a very good musician. He could have been a pianist or an organist had he not gone into politics. And in 1970 when he won, he had a sort of concert piano, moved into Downing Street, and then he unexpectedly loses in 74, and there's this very famous picture that comes out of Downing Street of the removal vans with a massive grand piano.
I mean, there is so much sort of, poignancy in that one picture, which is like, bam,
apparently Harold Wilson, all he wanted to do because obviously he'd left in 70, came back in 74. Apparently he there's a diary entry from one of his aides who talks about him just going around the house looking at the redecoration. All he wanted to do was just go and see what Ted Heath had changed.
Well, he wouldn't have been the last one, would he?
No, exactly. We'll be back just after this.
Let's get a voice note now from Hazel.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, before the returning officer announces the results to the public, are the candidates told the exact numbers, or are they told there's only 200 votes in it that would trigger a recount, or do they know for certain the result before they go on? Just wondering before we maybe see a couple of particular moments on Friday morning. Thank you.
Thanks, Hazel.
Hazel sounds like she might be a candidate. Just checking in. Yeah, they do know, but not with any great length of time. So they are told, I think, moments before.
Yeah, they get taken around the back by the returning officer and they read it out. And of course, they would have to do that anyway, because if it is really close, the agent, who is your sort of principal. What's the word for
Your
it?
eyes and
Advisor.
ears.
Yeah, it's the person who's your sort of legal officer for the election, for your campaign, has to decide whether there's going to be a recount or request a recount and so on. Obviously, it has to be for a fine margin. But yeah, they know when they go on stage. They already know, and that's why you remember, like Nick Clegg, for example, in 2015. As soon as they go on, sometimes you can just see it in their faces, sort of what's happened, because they already have been told.
And if you've been at a count and you're at some leisure centre somewhere or other, you can watch the piles adding up. So pretty much everyone has a fairly good idea of what the result is going to be. Go on.
I was going to say, I covered the election between the two brothers Miliband of who had won the Labour
Miliband,
leadership.
Yeah, same here.
It's a film with George Clooney. And when they came out, David looked very chipper and Ed looked very dour. And my co-host for this programme, No Name, said, "Oh, look, David's really happy. That means he's won." And he went on to break the news. And I was like, I wouldn't do that. I think the guy who's looking chipper is
Might just be
disguising
putting on a
the
brave
fact. Yeah,
face.
it's like the Oscars. Like, I'm going to smile for all it's worth until I burst into tears. And the guy who looked dour was the one realising that half his family would never speak to him again at that point. And so sometimes you try and read the faces, but they will be inscrutable just for those 10 seconds because they are inwardly trying to hold it together.
And the whole thing about recounts is really interesting because you can ask for a recount to save your deposit, to save a bit of humiliation. It's not always the recount just between who has won and who has come second. So there can be a whole pile of different reasons why you get a returning officer saying there will be a recount. But yeah, by and large, the candidates will have been told what the numbers are before they go on stage, and the person says, "I, the returning officer."
John has a question saying, what would you say are the best election night speeches from over the years?
Wow.
Well, it's the Mandelson one, of course.
I am a fighter and not a quitter.
That's a good one.
So that night,
So that's 2001.
2001,
wasn't it? Yeah.
I had been in Sedgefield.
Just to give the context, he'd resigned in the previous Parliament and
He'd
over
been-
scandal.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
and so-
There was a home loan that he hadn't declared from Geoffrey Robinson, and he had to resign from government. And he's sort of fighting his way back in
Hartlepool.
In
essentially,
Hartlepool.
Yeah.
I'm in Sedgefield with the Blair camp and about to be on the plane with Blair on the entourage to fly back to London, where he's obviously won a huge majority. And we are on a bus with Blair's family and various senior Labour Party people, and we've got the Radio 4 programme on of the election coverage. When Peter's speech comes on the radio across this bus, and everyone is just absolutely mortified by it. I mean, just what has Peter said? And that's all that anyone was talking about.
So I would say, John, that the thing to look out for is who is first out of the traps to blame their respective leader if things do not go right. Because last time it was Gareth Snell, I think, from Stoke, who lost his seat. And straight away, he basically broke ranks and said, "This is Corbyn." And he was the first, obviously, what we now know of many, Labour MPs who would be feeling similarly that result, which took them back to the worst one for Labour since 1935, was directly as a result of their leader. And so it is just as interesting, not just the victory speeches, but to hear how quickly the blame comes tearing in.
The thing is, because the thing is about election night speeches, as in like on the podium of the count, is that in terms of the leaders, the principals, they usually say very little, right? Because if you've
They
won
thank
the
everyone.
election,
There's
they
a lot
thank
of
everyone. They
thanking.
thank the police. They thank the returning officers. If you're the incoming prime minister, say perhaps Keir Starmer on Friday morning, he wants to keep his best stuff for the Downing Street moment, right?
Yeah.
You want to wait for that and make sure all the results are in and so on. And if you're the outgoing prime minister or leader of the opposition, whatever, likewise, you want to wait. So it tends to be in terms of kind of good speeches. They tend to be from lesser known places. I mean, Galloway in 2005, when he won off in Bethnal Green and Bow,
Una
off
King.
Una King, when he very famously said, Mr. Blair, this is for
Iraq.
Iraq. I mean, whatever you think about Galloway, as we talked about him on the show before, he ain't a bad orator.
He's a
It
good
was
orator,
hell of a
and he did.
hell of a moment.
And I think for many Labour voters who had abandoned Labour in 2005, as we know, it was actually a very small % of the national vote share overall that year. There were people who he spoke to, even if they hated him.
Yeah, completely.
And there are some that are just compelling because you have. I mean,
Well, wasn't it John Major? I loved the John Major one, 97. I don't know if it was a speech where he just said, "I'm off to the cricket."
Oh, that was it. That was the
people
next
have
morning,
spoken.
wasn't it?
That
was the next morning. The people have
yeah.
spoken. I listened. I'm
Yes.
off to the cricket.
Yeah.
It was the classiest way to go.
it was very classy, and Chris Patten as well. I mean, that must have been such a bittersweet moment where he was the Conservative Party chairman, masterminds the 1992 campaign, which is what we were talking about a moment ago with exit polls being wrong. But he loses his seat in Bath.
And sat on the steps and cried.
Yeah,
And then became the governor of Hong Kong. So actually, it worked out pretty well for him.
well, life's been all right for him. He's been chairman of the BBC and he's Chancellor of Oxford University. So he hasn't kind of been in the backwaters since then. But that moment where you've lost your seat, yet you have
But you
guided
saved
your
your
party
party, I know.
to victory. And that must be tough.
Okay. Why do some constituencies like Sunderland complete their count so quickly and others take up to 8 hours? Is it geographic logistics or just prestige to get it counted first?
Scotty.
That's from Scotty.
Both.
Yeah.
It's a bit of both. Yeah, I mean, Sunderland is. Sunderland's weird and unusual just because basically, I mean, this is a really weird story about this. One of the reasons Sunderland's first is that in recent years there has been a genuine rivalry between the returning officers in Sunderland and Newcastle.
Tyneside and Teesside.
The guy who did it in Newcastle, at least for the last few cycles, used to work in Sunderland, used to work for the winning team, went to work
It's like
at
Coke and
Newcastle.
Pepsi, isn't it?
And so
Basically.
now there's just been this competition which has gone on for quite a few cycles
But
now.
I think Newcastle is going to have a tricky time, actually, because the boundaries have made it more rural.
yeah.
So Sunderland, essentially, is a small, compact, metropolitan constituency.
With low turnout.
It's a much easier one. St Ives, famously in 2019, had to get votes from the Scilly Isles, and there was a big storm because it was in December, and they couldn't get the votes on the ferry to St Ives, and so it was, I think, one of the last ones. It was like 24 hours, and this time they've said, Scilly, you can count your own votes.
It won't take them long.
The Scilly Independence
It
Party
won't
is
take
going
them long.
Exactly.
Get all the votes in from St Mary's.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I went. The first time I went to the Isles of Scilly was for Harold Wilson's funeral.
In 1995?
Yeah.
That must have been... I'd have loved to have gone to that. That's a bit weird, but I would have loved to have gone to it.
That's so Lewis Goodall. That's Pete Goodall.
Yeah, that's jealousy.
I have been to Harold Wilson's grave in the cities, yes. It was one of the first places I took my now wife on holiday.
But
Was it your honeymoon?
It
Please
could have
tell
been.
me it was your
No,
honeymoon.
it could have been.
But it
Would
was
have liked that.
also Blair and Brown in the procession in the midst of the leadership contest about who was going to take over the Labour
Can I,
Party.
before we go to the last thing, can I just bring in, I know we've already talked about the exit poll, but Ben's question, who's I'm just interested if this ever happens to you, when he said, has an exit poll ever really changed the mood within the newsroom when it came in? When I did 2017, it really did, in the sense that I remember when I worked at Sky that time, we were doing loads of rehearsals, and we did rehearsals for every outcome from like a 200 Conservative majority, where I was having to react, doing the sophology to like, yes, that's a Conservative victory there in Hackney North and Stoke Newington. The Conservatives winning in that Labour seat, Diane Abbott's seat, all the way to a Conservative majority of like 12. But we'd not done any hung parliament stuff at all, right? And I knew that we were going to be in for an amazing, extraordinary night when, like 2 hours before, we were all still talking about a Conservative majority of between 40 and 60. And at 9:45, I knew the exit poll was coming in. And the head of Sky News, I'm sure he won't mind me saying, the head of Sky News at that time, John Riley, went in to see the results. And he came out and he looked really shocked. And he just came up to me and he said, Lewis, for the graphics, have we got a coalition builder? And I said, I think so, but we haven't practiced it. He said, I think it might be time to crack it out.
15 minutes before.
15 minutes before. So then the mood completely transformed.
This is from Julie, who asked very simply, what are you going to do on Friday when it's all over?
It's called a big bottle of Malbec, Julie. That's what it's called.
Funny you asked, Julie, because it allows us to tell you exactly what we're going to do on Friday.
No, Maitlis,
when it's not all
hang
over.
on. Before we started recording, you said you haven't had carbs and you haven't had alcohol for 6 weeks.
Yeah.
I would
Or
have thought.
sweeties.
I'd have thought you're letting rip, aren't you?
Yeah, but it's not
But that's
over.
that's the only thing you have. What
I
have
know.
you been doing?
I
I know.
know.
And
I
Maitlis without
exist on
sweeties.
vodka, sweeties, wine gums mainly, and caffeine. And actually, I've lost 2 out of those 3. Have you
no.
not noticed I've been a shadow of my former self?
Maybe
well,
she's
I
been
didn't
a
want
bit
to say
easier.
anything. Yeah, I think that's true. Have you thought about
None of
maintaining
those
this
insulin
regime?
spikes. Awful. So yeah, I think a dirty vodka martini with 3 olives and an entire vat of wine gums.
I was just going to say wine, but no, wine gums. Okay,
I'm going to go for the vat of wine.
I'll go for the
without
wine,
gums.
actually. Yeah, I'll take the wine. You have the gums.
I think we're all going to fall over, aren't we?
The thing is, no, but it's so exciting. Like, election night's brilliant. Like, it's Christmas, right? In so many, well, for us, not for the candidates. But I just always find that, you can, you finish broadcasting overnight and then you think, I'm going to get a few hours sleep. You can't really. You could, because it's all just getting going again. There are consequences.
And it doesn't end on Friday. I think that's the misnomer. You sort of think you're done on Thursday night, but you're not. So we will be recording for you here in this very studio at 5 o'clock on Friday morning. And then we will be carrying on doing our results in different places, I think. And then we'll be re-meeting about 12:30 and getting out another podcast. We might have a new Prime Minister. We might have had the moment or whatever. Or we might be getting the Isles from the Isles of Scilly.
New cabinet.
Yeah, new cabinet.
We're bringing you the latest results from the Isles of Scilly.
We think when our next Prime Minister clocks off, we might too. How about that?
I think that's a good idea. And by the way, if you're listening to this and you haven't voted, you really should go and vote.
Go vote.
And also,
vote.
and just
Take
to
your
say
dog.
that Lewis and I will be with Andrew Marr and Sheila Fogarty on LBC from 10 o'clock tonight, going through until 5 in the morning when we'll record the podcast. And then theoretically, we've been told we can try and go to sleep until we start recording again at 12.
And you can watch it on Global Play.
Yeah, I bet neither of us sleep. I bet we'll be watching everything unfold because it's going to be such an exciting night.
You can watch Channel 4.
And you can watch everything. You multi-screen.
You can.
You can multi-screen. If you're really weird, you can multi-screen, which is, let's be honest, most of you.
Right, we will see you. Come
On the
for
other
ride
side.
On the other side. Bye for now.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.